Indigenous journalisms play a crucial role in preserving cultural heritage, promoting social justice, and challenging mainstream narratives. Rooted in Indigenous knowledge systems and traditions, Indigenous journalists serve as vital storytellers within their communities, shedding light on issues that are often overlooked or misrepresented. According to a recent interview with APTN, Duncan McHugh states that Canadian media tends to have a whiteness problem, expressing how Canadian viewers are more interested in the stories they want him to tell rather than listening to who he is. When 8 out of 10 newsrooms in Canada do not have Indigenous journalists, the need for Indigenous voices and perspectives in journalism is immense. When we have Indigenous peoples telling Indigenous stories, we collectively gain deeper understandings of not only Indigenous struggles, but powerful positive perspectives and triumphs. In the spirit of discussing the topic of Indigenous journalisms and who gets to tell Indigenous stories, I've turned the lens around on myself, asking a very similar question. Who am I to tell Indigenous stories? My positionality is as follows. I'm white, I'm young, and I'm an able-bodied woman. I'm not a member of any First Nations, Métis, or Inuit communities. I have not had to navigate a culture that has actively tried to dismantle my right to exist, and I recognize and acknowledge the endless spaces of privilege that I have and continue to benefit within colonial law. I use the term settler as an identifier of my ongoing responsibility to being accountable of recognizing my biases, privileges, and limitations when it comes to understanding and reporting on Indigenous perspectives. Although my intentions may be rooted in decolonizing action and thought, I acknowledge that my desire to understand Indigenous worldviews does not mean that I am able to. This presentation is aimed at highlighting the need for more inclusive media organizations that reflect the living experiences of Indigenous journalists by recognizing powerful influence that media has on public opinion. And because I am not an Indigenous journalist myself, I utilize Indigenous voices and perspectives to share their stories.
Canada has had a history of looking away when it comes to our issues, when it comes to First Nation, Métis, Inuit issues. There's always been a prevailing belief in this country for many, many years, oh, that's not my problem, that's an Indian problem, or that's an issue for the federal government.
The Truth and Reconciliation Commission's final report specifically called on the media, stating the media's role and responsibility in the reconciliation process requires journalists to be well informed about the history of Aboriginal peoples and the issues that affect their lives. The report also stressed the need for increased coverage of Indigenous stories by Indigenous peoples.
The Truth and Reconciliation Commission has created calls to action specifically for the media as sweeping generalizations and stereotypes about Indigenous peoples by the media have caused significant harm and violence. And they've also missed out on opportunities to see and hear wonderful ways in which individuals and communities are showing up to revitalize and embrace their cultural connections. Number 84, it acknowledges the need for Indigenous programming, including Indigenous language speakers, along with equitable access to jobs within the CBC. Number 85 is specifically a call to the APTN to continue their programming and media initiatives. Number 86 is directed towards the Academy and journalism programs to require education on UNDRIP and history of Indigenous peoples. In his book, Decolonizing Journalism, Duncan McHugh brings up the importance of recognizing narrow narratives of Indigenous peoples in the media and that we miss out on so much of meaningful stories by reporting through a stereotypic lens. He shares a conversation he once had with an elder who told him that Indigenous peoples end up in the news due to the 4 Ds. McHugh then later added the 5th himself. They are 1. Beat your drum. Sure, stating the story with a kick of a drum is interesting, McHugh notes, but does the reporter know about the meaning of the song? Is it for honor or prayer or is it a memorial song? 2. Start dancing. Similar to drumming, in traditional regalia, showing Canada has multiculturalism. 3. Drunk. Why is there a stereotype when heavy drinking on the daily is 7 times higher in non-Indigenous people than Indigenous people? When reporting on a story in connection with Indigenous peoples, ask yourself, is alcohol relevant to the story and why? 4. Dead. Trauma porn is a term we often hear when it comes to media ensuring ratings. However, when the stories we hear about Indigenous people are of ones who are not even alive, it is safe to say that the mark of respectful storytelling is being missed entirely. And 5, act defiantly. We don't see iconic photos of reconciliation because harmony between Indigenous peoples and settlers is not newsworthy. Trauma-informed reporting is an approach that prioritizes the needs and well-being of individuals who have experienced trauma. It recognizes the potential harm that can be caused by insensitive or exploitive reporting and aims to minimize re-traumatization. 4 things to remember for engaging in trauma-informed reporting. Trauma-informed reporting centers on the healing needs of individuals who have experienced trauma. Building trust with interviewees is crucial. Transparency about the purpose and colonial impact of the interview is essential. Journalists should be mindful of the power dynamics at play and ensure that interviewees feel safe and empowered throughout the process. And 4, language and framing are important. Journalists should use respectful and non-sensationalistic language when discussing traumatic events.
IRP has been on the ground floor of trying to get a groundswell of change happening. You're actually the only ones doing this. You're the only ones doing this in the North, in our communities. And without your voice, we would be lost. It's on all of us to start learning, to make that effort, and to reach your hand across to communities and ask the communities, how can we tell your story better?
In the digital landscape, journalism has become more inclusive and participatory through the use of new technologies and platforms. Indigenous journalists and activists use social media platforms like Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram to engage in discourse, push back against misrepresentations, and provide alternative perspectives. They create a middle ground where different public discourses and expertise can emerge, challenging the usual expert voices found in mainstream media. In some parts of the world, some of the most up-to-date and reliable on-the-ground reporting is happening in real time through platforms like Instagram. When mainstream media outlets have a hard time getting into controlled nations and journalists are threatened with censorship from authorities, the international community is at the helm of restricted and controlled access to information. It is hard in this moment to speak to foreign correspondents without the mention of Palestine and the conflicting information that we're all being inundated with. The journalists who are currently reporting on the ground there are providing some of the only footage the world currently has access to, and it's through social media. Without them, we wouldn't see anything. As I speak, the right to move safely and freely within their homelands are being threatened by colonial violence, and Palestinian journalists are risking their lives every day to tell the stories of their people. The emotional tolls are mounting as they witness ongoing trauma and the loss of fellow Palestinians. Resources of food and water are limited and soon to be impossible to come by. What used to be symbols of protection and respected as non-combatants under the Geneva Convention, press jackets are now seen as targets in Gaza. And still, they're showing up every day, posting their stories, images, and footage to social media for the world to see. We've become reliant on these reporters, and they've become the voices of Palestinian liberation, people who have a right to self-determination. Some of these journalists, like Motaz, has over 12 million followers on Instagram and has become a voice for and of his people.
Hi, my name is Motaz. I'm from Gaza. I have no words for you. That is why I've risked my life to show you everything I filmed, everything I'm seeing. Every moment I capture is for you, to the world to take action. And here's how. You can bring life-saving, urgent relief to refugees in Gaza through UNRWA USA. You can bring medical help and distribution of whatever food and water is available. Every second I feel less sure that I will survive. I'm glad you are here, but please don't just watch my content. Please give now. Thank you and pray for Gaza.